Rain of Clarity I wrote nearly 20 years ago, I guess. And the purpose was to fill a gap in a way, which is that our tradition, the Sakya tradition, is not so well known as the other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. And so there's not much material that will kind of introduce the basic teachings, the most important teachings of the tradition to a Western audience. So that's what I wanted to do, to make a bridge, really. So somebody coming into contact with our tradition wanted to know, what are the main stages of the path of practice, the path of study, that I'm going to get involved with if I make a connection with a commitment to the Sakya tradition. So I based it entirely upon the kind of classic major works of our tradition, the Sakya tradition, works by Sakya Pandita and Sonam Tsemo and to a certain extent Konchok Lhundrup, and then set it out in the kind of stages of the pathway. When Kamathin Rinpoche wrote an introduction to it, he said it was like, the three vehicles from a Sakya perspective. And I think that more or less sums it up. But of course, I wanted to write it in a way that is accessible, so it's in kind of clear Western style language, but at the same time really faithful to the tradition, because there's no use trying to write a book that is just designed to lure people into something by presenting a false prospectus. So it is really traditional in a way that I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it could be translated from English into Tibetan, and then it would seem just like a Tibetan text. Okay, there are a few, one or two pages that refer to modern issues, which wouldn't be in an old-style Tibetan text, but nevertheless, it's kind of really square with the tradition. It kind of respects the intelligence of the tradition, lets the traditional teachings speak for themselves, but through a kind of English Western voice. So it's a relatively short book, but it packs a lot into it. So I begin with the first stage in the path, which is taking refuge in the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I explain what is the meaning of this phrase, going for refuge, the sense that we need to make a connection with something utterly truthful, which will steer us out of the kind of the morass of suffering that we call samsara, which will lead us to liberation, which will lead us eventually to fully realize our potential for enlightenment, the Buddha nature. So taking refuge is that step where we think, for us, it's the Buddhist path that I want to follow. Maybe not for everybody, actually, of course, certainly not at this point, but that's what we feel as an individual when we take refuge, and I make that point. And then explain the qualities of the three jewels, what each of them really represent, and what they embody, and how we relate to them through kind of confidence, of course, but also through intelligence and so on. So understanding their nature is really important. We can't be saved by blind faith, so we have to really understand what the three jewels are. And of course, I also make the point that as there are different levels of Buddhist practice, we talk about the different vehicles, then the refuges take on a different kind of context in those different vehicles. Even when we come to the Vajrayana, of course, then the Lama, the teacher, the guru, the tantric master is in a way the representative, the embodiment of three jewels. So I make that point, cover all that, and clarify questions like, can you be a Buddhist and a follower of another religion at the same time? And, the blunt answer is no, because why the hell would you want to do that? We think, the Buddha is, for us personally, the best of all teachers, so we don't want to mix that up. Of course, we can respect other philosophies, religious and non-religious, and see what's good in them. We should appreciate that. But for us, we made this kind of decision, the Buddha's path is the one for us. I also talk a little bit about the kind of moral discipline that we should follow. We would probably choose to follow if we begin in this way by taking refuge, what we call the individual liberation vow, which is both for monks and nuns, a very extensive set of trainings, and a more simplified kind of training for lay people. So I clarify that. And then that leads us to chapter 2, which is where I kind of broaden the path in a way by introducing what we would call, in Tibetan Buddhist perspective, the great vehicle, the Mahayana, where for the motivation of compassion becomes dominant. It's almost like having got our feet based upon something solid by taking refuge, then we can, in a way, we should look around the world and see, well, what afflicts me, what is the cause of my problems, is also afflicting all beings, and not just humans, by the way, but all sentient beings. And that really can open one up to the sense, well, the reason I'm practicing is not just for myself alone, but actually it's for the benefit of others, because they're suffering just as much, or perhaps even more sometimes, than I am. So I cannot privilege myself by simply entering the Buddhist path and going for my own individual freedom, important though that is. I must, in a way, think of the situation of all beings as well as my own. And that we call that sense of the dawn of a sense of universal responsibility, an ethic of altruism, where one's path is now for the benefit of others, we call Bodhicitta, or thought of enlightenment. So I describe that in chapter 2, and that leads me to talk about the so-called Bodhisattva vow. Whereas just when we take refuge, we become a Buddhist. When we make the Bodhisattva vow, motivated by this altruistic spirit of working for others, then we are Mahayanist. We're full of the Mahayana, specifically within Buddhism. So I talk about that, and I talk about how, how is the ceremony of the Bodhisattva vow, how it is useful. But of course, the crucial thing is that inner turning in one's heart, that generation of this enormously warm-hearted compassion of the Bodhisattva, the being destined for enlightenment. So that then leads me in chapter 3 to kind of follow through in discussing the training. What do you do if you made the Bodhisattva vow? What do you do if you're impelled by this altruistic motivation? Well, the simple answer is you practice the perfections, as we call them, or paramita. There are 6 practices, from giving through moral discipline, patience, effort, meditation, and wisdom. Actually, those virtues and practices are found throughout Buddhism. But what makes them specifically Mahayana, I explain in there, is that the motivation for practicing them is not for one's own gain or advantage, not even for one's own spiritual gain, in the sense of it will help me to become free from suffering. Now we should be motivated by the sense, what can I do to benefit others? And how can I become that being who is a source of benefit and bliss for others? A Buddha, to use that term. And the short answer is practice these transcendental virtues. Transcendental because they kind of bypass entirely that sense of it's for me, by putting others' needs first. And also at the same time, they gradually develop a perspective, well, what is this self? And who is the agent of giving? Who is that recipient? Who is the recipient? Aren't they really mutually dependent? Don't they really just exist only in mutual dependence? They don't stand alone. So I should approach these virtues of giving and so on with this sense of, actually, when I give, the person who I'm giving to is the giver, because he or she is actually giving me that opportunity to let go of my selfishness, my self-importance, and develop this and discover my potential for kindness and generosity and so on. So I trace through the 6 perfections, pointing out finally, of course, that the 6th one, wisdom, is actually in a way indispensable for each of them. So that although it looks like a succession from giving through to the easiest one, giving through to the most subtle, wisdom, it doesn't really work like that. We should give wisdom, the transformation of our perception, into all our actions. So that's the 3rd chapter, the 6 perfections. Now, talking about wisdom in that chapter leads into the 4th chapter, because the 4th chapter is really an exploration of what we mean by wisdom in the Mahayana sense. And that is, in that chapter, therefore, I have to talk about what we call the view, the Tawa. And for us, in Sakya tradition, as in all the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the philosophical school within Dharma, which in a way most fully unpacks the teaching on wisdom given by the Buddha in the discourses, the sutras, is the Madhyamaka, or middle way school, which was in a way elaborated by Nagarjuna and Arideva 2,000 years ago, a few hundred years after Buddha passed. So I unpack the teachings of the Madhyamaka school in that chapter. And just as I did with the teaching on refuge and Bodhisattva vow, I also explain a little bit about the history of this school, but it's only a few pages. And then I go into presenting it. First of all, by talking about the two truths, as we define them in Dharma. The fact that the way we look at the world, in a way, requires two eyes, in the sense that the way the world works, when we really look at it, everything works through dependent origination, or through the gathering of causes and conditions, different phenomena arise. It's like the mechanics of the world are dependent origination. So we need to know certain actions, certain conditions lead to certain results and not other results, and so on and so forth. So we can discriminate wisely between what is to be done and what is to be avoided. But that very teaching that everything is dependent, is arising through dependence, is at the same time the ultimate perspective too, when we think about it. Because if everything is arising only through dependence, through the gathering of causes and conditions, or through dependence upon parts, everything lacks solidity, everything lacks intrinsic nature. In other words, everything is empty of intrinsic nature. And that, from our perspective, is the actual ultimate truth of the world, that all phenomena, all beings lack this solidity we mistakenly project onto them, which mistaken projection is what is the basis of our dividing the world up into friend, enemy, near, far, desirable objects, hateful objects, etc., etc. In fact, the whole of this mess of samsara arises through our mistaken perceptions or projections on the world. And the Madhyamaka teaching on the two truths is the greatest therapy, if you like, for dismantling, for dissolving that mistaken perception, which is at the basis of all our suffering and difficulties, and the sufferings and difficulties we inflict upon others in the world. So I unpack the Madhyamaka, and particularly I present it from our Sakya point of view, because the different masters in Tibet, following on from the Indian predecessors, talked about Madhyamaka in different ways. And we in Sakya have a particular perspective on it. Actually, we would say it was the original perspective on Madhyamaka in Tibet, the ones that the early masters in the 12th, 13th centuries all shared, whether Kagyu or Kadam or Sakya or Nyingma. But later on it got a little bit kind of complicated in Tibet. Different systems of interpretation arose. But in a way, our Sakya view of Madhyamaka, which we call the Madhyamaka beyond all extremes, we would say it in a way represents the clearest presentation of Nagarjuna's original spirit and the spirit that Buddha taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So I unpack all that. And then that leads me to the last chapter, which is Vajrayana. If we start with the simple perspective and practice of the Hiniyan or Shravaka vehicle, where we're concerned primarily with working out why we suffer, then we open out in the compassion and with the profundity of the view and the wide compassion activity of the Mahayana. The way to make the swiftest approach to Buddhahood is actually what is taught in the uncommon or extraordinary Mahayana, which we can also call the Vajrayana, the indestructible vehicle. And that's the teachings given in the Tantras. So I unpack that in chapter 5, explaining what is significant, why it is in one way just a continuation of Mahayana. It's not a standalone system. It doesn't contradict the Mahayana. But what it offers, what the Vajrayana teachings offer in terms of swiftness of means for achieving our goal of becoming a fully enlightened being for the sake of others. So I explain where the Vajrayana teachings come from in the Tantras, and how do we enter them? Through receiving initiations, from tantric masters or lamas. I explain that. I explain a little bit about, again, the disciplines of Vajrayana, the vows and pledges, and mention a little bit about the different sets of tantras and the role of practicing meditation. I do all that without, of course, breaking the kind of fundamental injunction that the tantric teachings must only be passed on personally, and that one can't contradict that. One cannot, as it were, expound the techniques in a public way, because they just don't work that way. So it's fully, as with the other chapters, it's full of quotations from the great classical works of our Sakya tradition. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't try to kind of modernize things or introduce simplified, easier ways. It's kind of really, in a way, old school. And so, to go back to where I started, I intended the work as a bridge. So if you read this book or heard it discussed, you would then know where to go. So really I should start with these teachings. I need to Lama to explain these texts and these teachings to me, then to give me those. So I have a kind of map of progression through the teachings, and also a kind of like, I know the names of the key texts, the names of the key masters of the tradition. I have some guidebook. That's what I intended it to be. Not to replace the great works, but to give an introduction. So if somebody couldn't receive the major teachings for a while, they'd have enough to be going on with. But when they do meet the major teachings, they know what's what. They know this goes here, that goes there. That's what I should do first. I need this to underpin that. So it's to provide that kind of introductory guidebook to the tradition. It doesn't supplement a Lama's personal instructions, of course, but it's like background briefing for somebody about to undertake a journey. That's what Reign of Clarity is.